When we think of the term cosmic horror, we usually think of H.P. Lovecraft, and that's for good reason. Lovecraft is, of course, the most significant author in this genre. Many times he's credited as having created it. However, that simply is not the case. In fact, today we're going to be looking at a text that predates most of Lovecraft's work, but definitely predates all of his significant works. And this is Algernon Blackwood's The Willows. Reading The Willows as an avid Lovecraft fan will leave you in a sense of awe at how modern and comprehensible the prose is. You'll kind of realize that Lovecraft may not actually be the best, writer, so to speak, of the people who wrote cosmic horror fiction. This story was published in 1907, almost a full decade before Lovecraft started to be published, and just 1 year before he even penned his first published work. Although after that, young Lovecraft became quite active as a writer. So this is more or less in line with when Lovecraft started writing. Blackwood predates Lovecraft by quite a bit. And yet, what you will see here is prose that is more or less unsullied by the decadent and sometimes repetitive vocabulary that we see in authors such as Lovecraft. This story is more or less written in plain English, which makes it a much more enjoyable read overall. A weakness exemplified in some horror authors, Henry James is one I have a big problem with as well. To a lesser extent, H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith as well, is an attempt to kind of overawe the reader with an extensive vocabulary of a well read intellectual protagonist. And Blackwood generally doesn't do that. That may simply be because his protagonists tend to be a bit more common people, not really like masterful scholars. We don't really know much about the protagonist in The Willows, for instance. And in one of Blackwood's other famous works, The Wendigo, we have a cast of different characters, both intellectual and not. Anyways, to begin our summary of the story, we follow the journey of an unnamed, presumably English protagonist as he and his Swedish friend, also unnamed save for his nationality, ride a canoe down the Danube River in Hungary. Blackwood paints a picturesque scene of their travel. After leaving Vienna and long before you come to Budapest, the Danube enters a region of singular loneliness and desolation, where its waters spread away on all sides regardless of a main channel, and the country becomes a swamp for miles upon miles, covered by a vast sea of low willow bushes. Loneliness and desolation are far from welcoming words, even though our protagonist seems to be enjoying himself. Furthermore, we're introduced immediately to the ever present willow bushes for which the story is named. These willows will be a constant throughout the story, as one might expect. Even here in the first paragraph, we begin to imagine the narrow river almost besieged by innumerable willow bushes. The narrator describes the movement of the willows as making the entire plain seem alive, a personification of the plants and of the entire area that will become more sinister later on. Our protagonists enter into the desolation, the world of willows, winds, and waters, a separate little kingdom of wonder and magic, a kingdom that was reserved for the use of others who had a right to it, with everywhere unwritten warnings to trespassers for those who had the imagination to discover them. So early into the narrative, the alarm bells are already ringing. Our protagonists are entering into another realm, one that humans have no right to enter. Although this is a mere flight of fancy by our narrator, we will soon see that he is more correct than he knows. The use of the word imagination here is key, as the imagination and the dangers associated with it will play a crucial role in this story. In the first few pages of the novella, Blackwood has already established his central conceits: the aliveness of the willows, the accidental entrance into some kind of forbidden otherworld, and the dangers of human imagination. Here, I sense a pivotal change that exemplifies the change from fairy tale to weird fiction. And this is kind of what I mean. The fairy tales of older days and the romantic fiction that often drew inspiration from those fairy tales personify natural forces with either human benevolence or human malice. Here, Blackwood imbues nature with a kind of life, a kind of intelligence, but one that will turn out to be far different from human. Incomprehensible, one might say. Turning back to the story, our navigators attempt to make landfall on one of the Danube's temporary islands, but they find themselves disoriented and they cut their hands upon the willows when reaching out to grasp them, trying to get a foothold. The two men laugh joyously at the struggle as our narrator interprets the Willows' movements as a kind of applause at their efforts to land. The Willows are at once described as an army and also as a cheering throng of onlookers. The laughter of the two men here is notable as well, as this will be a motif that we see later on in the story. It soon becomes apparent that our narrator has underestimated the task ahead of him. After leaving Pressburg, everything changed a little, and the Danube became more serious. It ceased trifling. It was halfway to the Black Sea, within seeming distance almost of other, stranger countries where no tricks would be permitted or understood. It became suddenly grown up and claimed our respect and even our awe. It broke out into three arms. For one thing, that only met again 100 kilometers farther down, and for a canoe, there were no indications which one was intended to be followed. Gone are the friendly animals and pleasant sights of earlier stretches of the river. The men come across a common motif in horror fiction, a forked path. The river diverts into three streams. A Hungarian officer warns the men, if you take a side channel, you may find yourselves, when the flood subsides, 40 miles from anywhere, high and dry, and you may easily starve. There are no people, no farms, no fishermen. I warn you not to continue. And yet continue they did, with the narrator and his Swedish companion only taking some extra provisions. This element of the story, the recklessness of our protagonists, I think is a little bit of a red herring placed by Blackwood. We're now expecting that this could be a story of getting lost in the woods and of starvation in an inhospitable climate. But we're going to see that this is not the danger that is present in the story. The Willows are described again, this time as monstrous antediluvian creatures crowding down to drink around the river, appearing in overpowering numbers. The narrator begins to feel a curious emotion, an uneasiness far deeper than a feeling of awe or wonder. It was a vague, unpleasant idea that we had somehow trifled with these great elemental forces in whose power we lay helpless every hour of the day and night. Although he can't explain why, our narrator feels particularly strongly about the willow bushes. Acres and acres of willows, crowding, so thickly growing there, swarming everywhere the eye could reach, pressing upon the river as though to suffocate it, attacking my mind insidiously somehow by reason of their vast numbers, and contriving in some way or other to represent to the imagination a new and mighty power, a power, moreover, not altogether friendly to us. Our narrator is clearly shaken up by this revelation of this indecipherable hostility that he feels coming from the willows. The willows engulf the surrounding area, besieging the river and making any kind of escape by land impossible. To try to pass through would be to enter into their realm. We should note again the reference to the mind. It seems that the willows are making some kind of psychic attack on our narrator. At this point in the story, it seems that this attack is more imagined than it is real. The narrator is applying traits to the willows that aren't there. However, both the hostility of the willows and the suggestion of a mental attack will come into play later on. The narrator continues, this woke in me the curious and unwelcome suggestion that we had trespassed there upon the borders of an alien world, a world where we were intruders. The use of the word alien here will certainly get us thinking about extraterrestrials or forces from beyond the stars. Blackwood does a superlative job here of establishing things, first as mere conjecture, or even as a character's flight of fancy, slowly revealing that the hypothesis is more correct than it first appears. The narrator and the Swede then settle down in their camp, but peace doesn't last. The Swede cries out to our narrator, pointing to a dark mass in the water. A corpse. A black thing, turning over and over in the foaming waves, swept rapidly past. It kept disappearing and coming up to the surface again. We saw its eyes reflecting in the sunset and gleaming an odd yellow as the body turned over. Then it gave a swift, gulping plunge and dived out of sight in a flash. It doesn't take long for our narrator and his friend to come to the conclusion that what they saw was really an otter, despite the marked lack of wildlife in this stretch of the river. At this point, the reader does not have enough evidence to indicate whether or not our narrator is correct. After all, he is the narrator, and it's through his perception that we see things. It's notable, however, that it is the supposed diving of the thing back into the water that convinces the two that it is an otter, not any other kind of identification. This tendency to jump to comforting conclusions is a trait that the narrator keeps throughout most of the text, and it's understandable. It's very human to want to believe in the most comforting of possibilities, not the darkest. A mental health crisis averted, the men continue on with gathering wood for their fire. But as they turn back to the Danube, they see another figure in the river. This time, it is certainly a man on a boat. The man rushes by at great speed, but as he does, he makes the sign of the cross and shouts out to them. A mixture of the great distance between them and their presumed inability to speak Hungarian makes it impossible to make out what the man is saying, and he quickly disappears anyway, melting away down there into the Sea of Willows, where the sun caught them in the bend of the river and turned them into a great crimson wall of beauty. This is the most foreboding passage so far. Not only can we presume that this man is going to his doom, there's something really unearthly about the wording used here. The man melts into the Sea of Willows as if he's crossed some sort of boundary into another realm. He's no longer on Earth, but in the Willows, as if he has been claimed by them. This is the last time our protagonists will encounter another living human in this story. They too have been pulled into the world of the Willows. They just don't know it yet. As the men sit at camp, they avoid talking about any of the events that have just transpired. The narrator notes that silence has become natural to them. The oppressive atmosphere of the island on which they find themselves makes their speech illegitimate in some way. It was like talking out loud in a church or in some place where it was not lawful, perhaps not quite safe, to be overheard. Once again, the narrator compares the place to an alien world tenanted by willows only and the souls of willows. The willows went on chattering and talking among themselves, laughing a little, shrilly crying out, sometimes sighing. A host of beings from another plane of life, another evolution altogether, perhaps, all discussing a mystery known only to themselves. Once again, the narrator's not speaking literally here, but his words are more accurate than he realizes. The Willows have created a completely alien environment for him, and it dawns on him that he and his friends are interlopers, trespassers. We were not welcome. We were the first human influences on this island, and we were not welcome. The Willows were against us. The narrator tries to dismiss these thoughts of his as bizarre fancies, and yet he continues, imagining the Willows as an army controlled by some kind of divine force, one that will punish him and his companion for daring to trespass. The mention of the gods here is appropriate, as our narrator is about to meet them, in a way. The narrator wakes up in the middle of the night only to see immense bronze clad figures in one of the story's most enigmatic passages. You can see here my nice little doodle here. I couldn't quite get bronze, so I settled for an orange Pikmin kind of look on this drawing. Anyways, they were interlaced with one another, making a great column, and I saw their limbs and huge bodies melting in and out of each other, forming this serpentine line that bent and swayed and twisted spirally with the contortions of the wind-tossed trees. They were nude, fluid shapes, passing up the bushes within the leaves, almost rising up in a living column into the heavens. Their faces I never could see. Unceasingly they poured upwards, swaying in great bending curves, with a hue of dull bronze upon their skin. The appearance of these figures is jarring and extraordinary. They are clearly related to the Willows in some way, and yet they seem separate from them as well. They pass through each other at will, as though they were completely free from the constraints of physics. At this moment, the narrator is absolutely shocked. His mind fights against the reality of what he is seeing, trying to rationalize it as some kind of optical illusion. But it's all too strange to dismiss. Not only are the figures moving completely independently of the Willows, but their unusual bronze color makes it impossible for them to be some kind of shadow or trick of the light. What the narrator is seeing is real, and his feeble Victorian attempts to rationalize things, valiant though they may be, are ultimately fruitless. Our narrator steps out into the howling winds to investigate further. The figures still rose from earth to heaven, silent, majestically, in a great spiral of grace and strength that overwhelmed me at length with a genuine deep emotion of worship. I felt that I must fall down and worship, absolutely worship. Much as will later occur in the works of Lovecraft, the vision of these otherworldly creatures fosters in people a desire to worship them. These beings are gods in at least one sense of the word. But our narrator does not remain transfixed. As he is knocked over by the winds, he is knocked back to his senses as well. His rationality struggles against the very real sight that he perceives before himself. It must be a subjective experience, I argued. None the less real for that, but still subjective. The moonlight and the branches combined to work out these pictures upon the mirror of my imagination, and for some reason I projected them outwards and made them appear objective. I knew that must be the case, of course. I was the subject of a vivid and interesting hallucination. By Jove, though, was it all a hallucination? Was it merely subjective? Did not my reason argue in the old futile way from the little standard of the known? Those familiar with our genre will see here as well a trope that will become common, as we say, going mad from the revelation. The narrator is now battling back against the unknown with the only tool of an educated man of his time, his knowledge of what is possible and what is impossible. Blackwood poses an important question. How can rationality hold out against lived experience? Can scientific knowledge defeat that which someone sees with his own eyes? Our narrator will stretch rationality and scientific attitude to the breaking point to avoid admitting the things that he is seeing, actively experiencing, and in the end, it may be this closed mindedness that saves him in a way, at least from the worst horrors that he is to encounter. Through the night, the narrator hears the pattering of things outside the tent. He finds, quite unsettlingly, that the Willows have somehow moved nearer to the tent, creeping with silent feet over the shifting sands, drawing imperceptibly nearer by soft, unhurried movements. But had the wind moved them, or had they moved by themselves? There was a suggestion here of personal agency, of deliberate intention, of aggressive hostility, and it terrified me into a sort of rigidity. Our narrator's instinct at seeing and comprehending the horrible implication is an odd one. He wants to laugh. But the laughter came no more readily than the cry, for the knowledge that my mind was so receptive to such dangerous imaginings brought the additional terror that it was through our minds and not through our physical bodies that the attack would come and was coming. This passage represents the very best of this genre. The danger of encountering these horrible things from beyond Earth is really the damage that it does to the fragile mind of the human victim. Were the villain of this story some kind of dangerous monster and might give the audience some occasional frights. However, instead, the villain of this story seems to be, at least at this point, physically harmless. It's an absurdity that the menace of this story is essentially a bunch of bushes. But the way in which it's portrayed as a kind of gnawing psychological terror that slowly but steadily erodes the sanity of our protagonist succeeds in turning the Willows into a very tangible threat. The fear of our protagonist will soon become not just one of death, but of unmaking or transformation. Their fear becomes that they will transform by exposure to this alien environment into something other than themselves. As I mentioned earlier, our narrator expresses a desire to laugh at this terrifying moment when he's being besieged by these bushes. Laughter, as we've seen earlier in the story, is kind of a shield for the narrator. He uses it to defend himself from seriously considering the circumstances he's in. Much like his logic, it's a crutch that he can use to prevent himself from slipping into the thoughts about his dismal situation. Here, we see its first failure as our narrator is physically and mentally incapable of producing laughter. The laughter does not come as easy as crying. The absurdity has become reality, and in so doing, becomes horrifying. It's often said that there's a fine line between horror and comedy. Horror often becomes comedic if it's poorly executed or goes too far into excess. But it seems that the opposite can also happen. The idea of being besieged by hostile trees is ridiculous, but once it becomes a verifiable reality, it passes the barrier from fiction to fact. The premise becomes terrible to imagine. I think when something is outside of all sense or reason, it becomes all the scarier to have to actually grapple with its existence. This might be one of the reasons why people find murderous clowns, for instance, so terrifying. There's a certain absurdity to the situation of being stalked by a children's entertainer whose main job is making balloons for children. I feel like being hunted by trees is probably a similarly ludicrous, if terrifying, concept. Our narrator holds out hope that the thing he has seen has not been seen by his friend as well. Provided my experiences were not corroborated, he says, I could find strength somehow to deny them. Once again, an incredible inversion by Blackwood. It would be so natural for the narrator to seek corroboration, to make sure that he's not just losing his mind here. But the implication of that, the danger of being proven correct, is too great. Any kind of validation that he actually saw what he saw would destroy whatever sanity he has left. It's a wonderful kind of paradox. Believing that he is going mad is the only thing that will keep him sane. He needs to believe that he's hallucinating, because if what he saw is real, well, then we're in real trouble. The next morning, the narrator notices that his companion is more timid than usual for some reason, and not in a rush to leave the island. At first, this perplexes him, but he soon finds out the reason for his friend's change in demeanor. The steering paddle for their boat has been snapped in half, and what's worse, there's now a hole at the bottom of the boat. The narrator realizes that the rending of the wood is bad enough that it would have allowed them to make it to midstream, only for the boat to then quickly sink, almost as if it was very intentionally done that way. The rupture in the wood was made so subtly that it is almost impossibly malicious. It seems designed to kill the men, either by drowning them or drenching them in water, leaving them vulnerable to hypothermia. There is some kind of malignant intelligence to this, perhaps. It seems almost out of place, in my opinion, in this story to have such an overt and seemingly targeted attack on our protagonist's life. But it could be here that Blackwood is still keeping us guessing as to the nature of what is really going on here. Is this a ghost story? Is it caused by a monster? At this point, we really don't know. We might be dealing with a targeted attack by some kind of human intelligence, or we might be seeing something as of yet unexplained. The words of the Swede here are very disconcerting. There, you see an attempt to prepare a victim for sacrifice. And this word, sacrifice, shows up a lot from now on. The Swede begins talking about himself and the protagonist in these terms as a sacrifice for something. At this point, it's becoming more and more clear that the odd happenings in this place can't be a matter of mere subjectivity. There has to be something going on here. There must be some kind of malice at work for all this to be happening to them. Once again, however, we will see the narrator attempt to feebly reason his way out of the predicament. He hypothesizes that the boat ran along some sharp rocks on the shore. the only issue being that there are no rocks on this stretch of the Danube. He then makes the outlandish but technically plausible claim that one of them destroyed the paddle while in a bout of sleepwalking. The Swede becomes impatient at these responses, but he allows them for a time. Our narrator begins concocting scientific explanations for the phenomena, stating, "There were deep hollows formed in the sand that I now noticed for the first time, basin shaped and of various depths and sizes, varying from that of a teacup to a large bowl. The wind, no doubt, was responsible for these miniature craters, just as it was for lifting the paddle and tossing it towards the water. The rent in the canoe was the only thing that seemed quite inexplicable, and after all, it was conceivable that a sharp point had caught it when we landed. The examination I made of the shore did not assist this theory, but all the same I clung to it with that diminishing portion of my intelligence which I called my reason. An explanation of some kind was an absolute necessity, just as some working explanation of the universe is necessary, however absurd, to the happiness of every individual who seeks to do his duty in the world and face the problems of life." There are two important features to note in this passage. First, it contains mention of the hollows in the sand, which will become very important later on. Secondly, we recall that this is a post fact narrative by the narrator. He is recounting events that have occurred in the past, and while he does an excellent job of expressing his emotional state at the time, he's aware of all the events that are to follow. Therefore, it shouldn't be surprising to us when he's critical of his own thought process here and seems to chide himself for clinging so much to his reason. At the time, his explanations were a tool for keeping himself sane, and the narrator implies that even in the moment, he had an inkling that these explanations were unsatisfactory for him. Looking back, he sees how foolish they were, and yet also how necessary they were, and how necessary explanations in general are for human beings to be able to survive. Blackwood is exceptionally good at inserting these little truths about the human condition into his horror stories. Most of us can relate to the narrator here. There are certain comfortable lies or half truths that people cling to in order to make life bearable. Some of these ideas might even be true on the face of them. As our narrator describes, most of us desire some kind of explanation for how things work, an explanation of the universe, but it really doesn't matter if that explanation is true or not. What matters is that there's an acceptable starting point on which to base our experiences. As Lovecraft and so many later authors have done, Blackwood questions what happens to a person's mind when such fundamental principles of understanding are all at once upended. Much like a protagonist in Lovecraft's work, the narrator here tries valiantly for a time to fit the strange occurrences into an acceptable framework of logic, but he ultimately falters. Eventually, the dialogue between the narrator and his friend returns to the otter sighting of the previous night. The Swede asks the obvious question: was it really an otter they saw? At this point, the Swede's mind is opening up to so many different possibilities. Perhaps it was too big to be an otter. Perhaps the man they saw on the boat was not really a man at all. Our narrator answers these ideas with a bravado that dissolves into hysterics. "Look here now," I cried. "This place is quite queer enough without going out of our way to imagine things. That boat was an ordinary boat, and the man was an ordinary man, and they were both going downstream as fast as they could lick, and that otter was an otter, so don't let's play the fool about it." There's something humorous in the tone of this line, but I also think it's written in such a beautiful way. The way the narrator is talking here is clearly not convincing to his friend, himself, or the reader. We can imagine the panicked tones with which these words are delivered very easily. Not getting the desired response, he continues until the Swede responds thunderously: "You fool! You utter fool! That's just the way all victims talk. As if you didn't understand just as well as I do. The best thing you can do is keep quiet and try to hold your mind as firm as possible. This feeble attempt at self-deception only makes the truth harder when you're forced to meet it." Our narrator accepts that the Swede is right, but his friend adds that it's best not to talk about what they have seen at all, a recognition of the idea that they might talk things into existence if they are careless. Our protagonists go about their day fishing, collecting driftwood, and so on, trying to avoid thoughts of what they have seen. The wind becomes quiet, and the narrator remarks that When common objects in this way become charged with the suggestion of horror, they stimulate the imagination far more than things of unusual appearance. And these bushes, crowded huddled about us, assumed for me in the darkness a bizarre grotesquerie of appearance that lent to them somehow the aspect of purposeful and living creatures. Their very ordinariness, I felt, masked what was malignant and hostile to us. This is an excellent point by the narrator, and I imagine the author himself, describing the horror of the mundane. It's been a while since we've seen a description of the willow bushes, and this brings them back into the reader's mind quite nicely. Nonetheless, our narrator finds himself becoming more and more susceptible to the haunting effect of this place, and he firmly dreads the oncoming night. The two secure their remaining oar and waterproof the canoe, hoping to stay only one more night on the rapidly diminishing island. But the oddness doesn't end. The Swede begins to talk to the narrator about a peculiar sound that he's been hearing in the air, likened to the sound of an immense gong. The willows, he notes, are motionless and silent now. It was repeated at regular intervals, but it was certainly neither the sound of a bell nor the hooting of a distant steamer. I can liken it to nothing so much as the sound of an immense gong suspended far up in the sky, repeating incessantly its muffled metallic note, soft and musical as it was repeatedly struck. My heart quickened as I listened. The Swede describes how he had attempted to locate the source of the sound, saying, "Well, you slept this afternoon. It came all round the island. I hunted it down, but could never get near enough to see, to localize it correctly. Sometimes it was overhead, and sometimes it seemed under the water. Once or twice, too, I could have sworn it was not outside at all, but within myself. You know, the way a sound in the fourth dimension is supposed to come." The mention of the fourth dimension here is where we really get cooking in regards to the speculative fiction element of the story. I think Blackwood does a good job here, never outright confirming that all of the weird happenings are linked specifically to the fourth dimension, but it gives the reader the idea of what we're dealing with here. The Swede heard the sound coming from everywhere all at once, including within himself. The only explanation for such a sound, that he can think of at least, is that the sound is coming from another plane of existence, this fourth dimension. We get a little bit closer to understanding what exactly we're dealing with here. Ignoring our narrator's futile attempts to explain the sound naturally, the Swede continues on. It comes off the whole swamp. It comes from everywhere all at once. It comes from the willow bushes somehow. Our narrator protests. But now the wind has dropped. The willows can hardly be making a noise by themselves, can they? And in response, the Swede drops one of the very best lines in this text, and indeed in all of horror literature, in my opinion, as he reveals, "It is because the wind has dropped we now hear it." The sound is not coming from the wind. The sound is being made independent of the wind. Another scientific impossibility that hints at a darker discovery. The Swede is about to say something, but he's interrupted by the overboiling of a pot of food. It sounds like he's going to say something like this: "It is the cry, I believe, of the gods of this place." As our narrator goes to check on the stew, he tells the Swede to get bread and cut it up. There's just one problem: the bread is gone. The Swede lets out a sickening, forced laugh, as though forcing himself to be amused rather than terrified at the implications of yet another supernatural occurrence in the vanishing of their food supply. The stain of psychical pressure caused it, this explosion of unnatural laughter in both of us. It was an effort of repressed forces to seek relief. It was a temporary safety valve, and with both of us it ceased quite suddenly. Our narrator tries to rationalize it as having simply forgotten the loaf of bread he meant to buy in Pressburg, despite both of them clearly remembering having bought the bread. In a really excellent comic moment, the Swede tells the narrator that the oatmeal has also been stolen, and the narrator gets so frustrated with him bringing it up. Blackwood, much like Lovecraft, is actually a pretty good comic writer, and I'll admit that this is some much needed levity. Basically, our narrator says, "Oh, well, we still have plenty of oatmeal," to which the Swede also says, "Yeah, basically, a lot of it got stolen," and the narrator just gets pissed off at him saying that. The men eat and smoke in near silence, trying to avoid the topic of their current situation. But I saw that I could not get along much longer without the support of his mind, and for that, of course, plain talk was imperative. As long as possible, however, I postponed this little climax and tried to ignore or laugh at the occasional sentences he flung into the emptiness. The narrator has a compulsive need to relieve his mind by talking about these experiences, even though he knows that this has a tendency only to make things worse. His companion, however, speaks incoherently. There are things about us, I'm sure, that make for disorder, disintegration, destruction. The sound doesn't come to me by the ears at all. The vibrations reach me in another manner altogether, and they seem to be within me, which is precisely how a fourth dimensional sound might be supposed to make itself heard. It is a non human sound. I mean, a sound outside humanity. Our narrator now very much regrets wanting to speak frankly with his friend. The following passage is really excellent and also quite important in the history of cosmic horror literature, so I will reproduce it in its entirety here. The solitude of that Danube camping place, can I ever forget it? The feeling of being utterly alone on an empty planet. My thoughts ran incessantly upon cities and haunts of men. I would have given my soul, as the saying is, for the feel of those Bavarian villages we had passed through by the score, for the normal human commonplaces, peasants drinking beer, tables beneath the trees, hot sunshine, and a ruined castle on the rocks behind the red-roofed church. Even the tourists would have been welcome. Yet what I felt of dread was no ordinary ghostly fear. It was infinitely greater, stranger, and seemed to arise from some dim ancestral sense of terror more profoundly disturbing than anything I had known or dreamed of. We had strayed, as the Swede put it, into some region or some set of conditions where the risks were great, yet unintelligible to us, where the frontiers of some unknown world lay close about us. It was a spot held by the dwellers in some outer space, a sort of peephole whence they could spy upon the earth themselves unseen, a point where the veil between had worn a little thin. As the final result of our too long a sojourn here, we should be carried over the border and deprived of what we called our lives, yet by mental, not physical processes. In that sense, as he said, we should be the victims of our adventure. A sacrifice. The two men settle down into silence, now even more sure that their destruction is imminent. Everything seems hopeless now. The situation called for a courage and calmness of reasoning that neither of us could compass, and I have never before been so clearly conscious of two persons in me, the one that explained everything, and the other that laughed at such foolish explanations, yet was horribly afraid. The narrator finally breaks his facade, confiding to the Swede about his horrible fear of the place. His friend replies, white in the face, himself shook with incredible fear. It's not a physical condition that we can escape from by running away, he replied in the tone of a doctor diagnosing some grave disease. We must sit tight and wait. There are forces close here that could kill a herd of elephants in a second as easily as you or I could squish a fly. Our only chance is to keep perfectly still. Our insignificance, perhaps, may save us. The Swede explains his theory that the forces from beyond have not yet seen them, and yet they might if the two make themselves too conspicuous. In his mind, they must wait for some kind of distraction, activity that will get the eyes of the gods, the elements, whatever they are, off of them. He continues, we must keep our minds quiet. It's our minds they feel. We must control our thoughts, or it's all up with us. Exactly how did the Swede figure out that the hostile forces in this environment can feel them through their minds? The idea of psychic attack has already been brought up numerous times by the narrator, and perhaps it seems odd that the two of them might be coming to the same conclusion. I think that if Blackwood gave too much positive evidence for this idea, then it would be a legitimate problem with the writing if we got too many clues that these two are exactly correct in what they hypothesize. As it stands, however, I think these lines are perfectly fitting for the situation. The narrator and his friend are clearly two intelligent men left in a completely alien space. They're using whatever information they can to gather to save themselves, and it makes sense that they may be jumping to conclusions or giving their best guess based on their experience so far. The narrator asks the Swede if the fate he is talking about is their death, Once again, the Swede provides us with one of the very best lines in a horror story ever. Worse, by far. Death, according to one's belief, means either annihilation or release from the limitations of the sense, but it involves no change of character. You don't suddenly alter just because the body's gone. But this means a radical alteration, a complete change, a horrible loss of oneself by substitution, far worse than death, and not even annihilation. We happen to have camped in a spot where their region touches ours, where the veil between has worn thin. Once again, we may ask exactly how the Swede knows all this. Indeed, I don't think the story ever gives enough evidence to determine whether or not the Swede is correct in this assumption. But all of the narrator's talk earlier of psychic attacks and his implication that his friend has been changing mentally definitely gives some credibility to this idea. The use of the word annihilation here brought to my mind a film of the same name, also, I guess, a book of the same name, which had something of a similar premise behind it. In that film, the researchers slowly succumb to both physical and mental attacks, literally transforming them into new organisms. The fear of being changed, altered, so that one's own self is, in essence, eternally and irrevocably destroyed, is absolutely more intense than mere death. The fear of the men is not just that the forces from beyond will be their doom, but that they will join these forces in some way, become part of their world, and ultimately lose their minds and identities. We go from this section to yet another absolutely fantastic one that encapsulates better than any other the entire genre of cosmic horror. The Swede explains, all my life I have been strangely, vividly conscious of another region, not far removed from our own world in one sense, yet wholly different in kind, where great things go on unceasingly, where immense and terrible personalities hurry by, intent on vast purposes, compared to which earthly affairs, the rise and fall of nations, the destinies of empires, the fate of armies and continents, are all dust in the balance. Vast purposes, I mean, that deal directly with the soul, and not indirectly with mere expressions of the soul. You think, he said, it is the spirit of the elements, and I thought, perhaps, it was the old gods, but I tell you now, it is neither. These would be comprehensible entities, for they have relations with men, depending upon them for worship or sacrifice, whereas these beings who are now about us have absolutely nothing to do with mankind, and it is by mere chance that their space happens to just at this spot touch our own. Here we see a clear statement of the essence of cosmic horror. Our protagonists, by mere happenstance, find themselves in the paths of immense beings which are far greater than we can even fathom. Our insignificance may be the only thing that keeps us safe from them. As the Swede says, the rise and fall of nations, the destinies of empires, all of these things are of such insignificance as to be beneath the notice of these beings from beyond. He continues, it's the Willows, of course. The Willows mask the others, but the others are feeling about for us. If we let our minds betray our fear, we're lost, lost utterly. He looked at me with an expression so calm, so determined, so sincere, that I no longer had any doubts to his sanity. He was as sane as any man ever was. If we can hold out through the night, he added, we might get off in the daylight unnoticed, or rather, undiscovered. At this moment, the sound of the gong in the air approaches nearer, and the Swede begs for silence. By merely mentioning the force from outside, they have drawn it closer. Whatever it is that's interested in finding them is getting closer, closer in a way that cannot be properly understood. The humming sound is their sound, the Swede says, the sound of the beings from beyond or of their dimension. In some way, the surrounding willows have become a symbol of these otherworldly beings. I could not follow exactly what he meant by this, yet the thought and idea in my mind were beyond question the thought and idea in his. I realized what he realized, only with less power of analysis than his. It was on the tip of my tongue to tell him at last about my hallucination of the ascending figures in the moving bushes, when he suddenly thrust his face again close into mine across the firelight and began to speak in a very earnest whisper. He amazed me by his calmness and pluck, his apparent control of the situation. This man I had for years deemed unimaginative, stolid. The Swede tells the narrator that they must act as normal as possible to avoid the suspicion of the beings from beyond, but he also gives the narrator an impossible task. He must not even think about the things from beyond. They discuss the pits in the ground from earlier, and the Swede asks the narrator to avoid thinking about them most of all. Their strategy of avoiding thinking about things fails almost immediately, as the narrator ends up drawing attention to the two of them regardless. Then something happened. Something unimportant, apparently, as the way in which the nerves are in a very great state of tension, and this small thing for a brief space gave me an entirely different point of view. I chanced to look down at my sand shoe, the sort we used for the canoe, and something to do with the hole at the toe suddenly recalled to me the London shop where I had bought them, the difficulty of the man had in fitting me, and other details of the uninteresting but practical operation. At once in its train followed a wholesome view of the modern skeptical world I was accustomed to move in at home. I thought of roast beef, and ale, motor cars, policemen, brass bands, and a dozen other things that proclaimed the soul of ordinariness or utility. The effect was immediate and astonishing even to myself. Psychologically, I suppose, it was simply a sudden and violent reaction after the strain of living in an atmosphere of things that to the normal consciousness must seem impossible and incredible. But whatever the cause, it momentarily lifted the spell from my heart and left me for the short space of a minute feeling free and utterly unafraid. I looked up at my friend opposite. "You damned old pagan," I cried, laughing aloud in his face. "You imaginative idiot! You superstitious idolater! You—" I stopped in the middle, seized anew by the old horror. I tried to smother the sound of my voice as something sacrilegious. The Swede, of course, heard it too, the strange cry overhead in the darkness, and that sudden drop in the air as though something had come nearer. He had turned ashen white under the tan. He stood bolt upright in front of the fire, stiff as a rod, staring at me. "After that," he said in a sort of helpless, frantic way, "we must go. We can't stay now. We must strike camp this very instant and go on, down the river." The Swede collapses at once, and the narrator realizes that he must now take charge of the situation. Rather than flee, he determines that they must stay one more night upon the island. It is at this moment that the forces from beyond finally approach and make themselves felt more than ever before. There, in front of the dim glow, something was moving. Some massive, yes, entity, larger than any land animal, approaches. It comes toward the narrator and the Swede, who are now completely helpless, and the narrator describes his fate very succinctly. "My eyes were tightly shut. Something in my throat choked me. A feeling that my consciousness was expanding, extending out into space, swiftly gave way to another feeling, that I was losing it altogether and about to die. The Swede pulls the narrator back, causing him to feel an intense pain, and just then, the entity, whatever it is, suddenly departs. The narrator rights himself to find the Swede unconscious. Both of them have been saved by a change in their mental state. For the narrator, it would seem that the jolt of pain took his mind off of the beings and made him temporarily invisible to them. As for the Swede, his unconsciousness produced the same effect. The narrator laughs once again, a hysterical laugh, the immense relief leaving his body. Great healing gusts of shaking laughter that brought a tremendous sense of relief in their train. Laughter had earlier been a weak attempt to shield the mind from terror. Now it reappears as an effective aid for their sanity. There is a feeling that the danger is past, at least for the moment. As the two men approach their collapsed tent, however, they notice something odd. Great funnels in the sand now surround their tent in the spot where the shadowy beings had been. At this point, we have passed the climax of the story. In one last effort to secure his friend's safety, the Swede attempts, in the middle of the night, to offer himself as a sacrifice, trying to leap into the river and distract the creatures, in a way also giving up his own life. The narrator leaps on the Swede to attempt to prevent him from leaping into the river. All the while, his friend yells about going inside to them and taking the way of the water and the wind. But at last, the narrator succeeds in subduing his friend and dragging him unconscious back to the tent. As dawnlight filters in, the humming and buzzing noises finally stop. The horror is over. The Swede is convinced that another sacrifice must have been found in place of the two of them, and his theory is soon confirmed. The two men soon find a body in the river. They intend to bury it, but the body twists around in the water. What the two see horrifies them anew. For just as the body swung round to the current, the face and the exposed chest turned full towards us and showed plainly how the skin and flesh were indented with small hollows, beautifully formed and exactly similar in shape and kind to the sand funnels that we had found all over the island. Their mark, I heard my companion mutter under his breath. Their awful mark. As the body floats down the river, the narrator can only remark on how closely its bobbing in the water resembles the movement of an otter. I've already done quite a lot of talking as we went through the story, but here I would like to collect my thoughts a bit more succinctly. I think that The Willows is not a piece of proto cosmic horror as it is often called. I believe that it's a fully fledged entry into the genre. Now, I don't think that Blackwood really invented the genre, just like I don't believe Lovecraft did. But this is one of the clearest examples of the genre that I've ever seen. In fact, I might even call it the pinnacle of the genre. In terms of style, there's really no contest. Blackwood is one of the best horror authors of all time, and I found his prose infinitely more readable than Lovecraft's in many cases. In terms of theme as well, this is a full fledged cosmic horror story, and it embodies the themes of the genre better than anyone else. The protagonists of the story don't even go looking for trouble as many of Lovecraft's do, and they also aren't great scientists. They seem to be a normal pair of educated, well to do men who find themselves thrust into a horrible, unknown world. They didn't go looking for the weird and the strange, it came to them. They survive by their own admission due to their own sheer insignificance. Again, this theme of cosmic insignificance so beautifully demonstrated here. The entities that they face are truly otherworldly, not able to be perceived except through sound and shadows, and merely making contact with them seems to be fatal. To be seen by them mentally causes a slow death through madness, and it seems that physical contact causes parts of the body to be disintegrated. They are truly, truly strange beings. They don't look like anything from our reality. And the story doesn't just succeed as a piece of cosmic horror. As a psychological horror story, it's also absolutely fantastic. The vast majority of the terror of this story occurs within the mind of the narrator and his friend. At first, many of the things that he sees can be written off as merely the mind playing tricks on itself. But as we delve further into the text, it's the psychological reaction of the characters to this very real danger that makes the story truly interesting. The denial, the hysteria, the almost maniacal laughter that the two men engage in. It's an absolutely beautiful image of the human mind coping with things that it cannot comprehend. Even at the end of the story, the narrator knows practically nothing for certain about what really happened on that stretch of the Danube, and we can only feel glad for him because there's no question that his ignorance in some way saved his life. If the hypothesis of the Swede is correct, to know about these things is to die. To know entities from beyond is, in fact, in some way, to become them, leading to a fate far worse than death. If you haven't checked out this story before, you absolutely should read it. Even my summary with these many quotations that I used can't do it justice. It's really not a very long read, and it's perhaps the most fantastic horror story I've ever read.